In the American frontier, winter was not a season, it was a verdict. Out here, no idea survived on reputation. No theory mattered. No man won an argument with words. Winter decided what worked and what failed, and it did so without mercy. If your shelter was wrong, you didn't just feel uncomfortable, you froze. If your fire plan was weak, you didn't just burn more wood, you ran out. If your thinking was flawed, the cost was measured in fingers, toes, or graves. That's the world we're stepping into. Late 19th century mountain settlements lived with a simple truth. Cold was the enemy that never negotiated. You couldn't outwork it. You couldn't rush it. You couldn't tough it out forever. You either planned for it correctly or winter collected its payment. Most men believed they understood this. Their cabins followed patterns passed down from fathers and grandfathers. Single log walls, mud and moss chinking, a stove or fireplace in the center, fire on warm, fire out cold. Everyone accepted this cycle as normal. Dangerous, yes, but familiar. And familiarity breeds confidence. Confidence is useful on the frontier. It keeps you moving, but it can also blind you, because when something has always worked, people stop asking how well it works, or whether it could work better. Winter exposes that kind of thinking. Every few decades, a season comes along that strips away comfort and illusion. A winter colder than memory, longer than expected, harder than preparation allowed for. Those winters don't care how many cabins you've built or how long your families lived in the valley. They test only one thing: whether your shelter holds heat when the fire dies. This story begins before such a winter arrives, before the snow stacks deep, before water freezes indoors, before families burn through their woodpiles and start making desperate choices. It begins at the moment when one man looks at the cold and decides not to fight it harder, but to outthink it. And in frontier America, that decision alone was enough to make you a target for ridicule. Because the frontier doesn't trust new ideas until winter proves them right. Frontier cabins were built to one standard good enough to survive last winter. Most settlers didn't design cabins, they copied them. A pattern learned from a neighbor who learned it from his father, who learned it from someone who survived long enough to pass it on. That alone gave the design authority. If it hadn't killed the last man, it must be right. The typical cabin was simple. Single log walls hand-notched at the corners. Gaps stuffed with mud, clay, moss, whatever sealed fastest. The roof pitched low to shed snow. One door, one or two small windows because glass was expensive and openings leaked heat. In the center sat a stove or fireplace, the heart of the structure. Heat followed a predictable rhythm. Fire burned, air warmed. Fire died, warmth vanished. Logs slowed the loss slightly, but not much. Pine and spruce were easy to cut and stack, but they didn't hold heat. They only delayed the cold. Every family learned this rhythm. Wake early, stoke the fire. Feed it through the day. Wake again at night to keep it alive. Let it fail, and the cabin would be near freezing by morning. This wasn't considered a flaw. It was considered frontier reality. Men judged cabins by speed, not performance. How fast could it go up before snow? How little labor did it require? How many winters had this method already survived? Efficiency meant getting walls standing quickly, not keeping heat overnight. And because most winters were harsh but manageable, the system seemed proven. But proven only meant no one had tested the limits. Cabins weren't built for comfort. They were built to avoid death. A floor at 35 degrees was unpleasant but acceptable. Ice on the inside of windows was common. Sleeping in layers was normal. Children learned early that winter meant enduring, not resting. No one expected warmth without constant fire. No one imagined a cabin that stayed warm after the stove went cold. And that assumption shaped everything. It shaped how much wood families cut, how often they woke at night, how much risk they accepted as normal. It shaped the belief that cold was something you could only fight, never manage. That belief was about to be challenged not by theory but by construction, and by a man who refused to accept good enough as the final answer. The man who questioned that belief was not reckless. He was careful because he had already paid the price for being unprepared. Years earlier, during his first winter in the mountains, he lived in a standard cabin just like everyone else. Same logs, same chinking, same stove. And like many newcomers, he trusted the design because everyone said it worked. He learned the truth one night when the fire died faster than expected. The wind had risen. Snow pressed hard against the walls. By morning, the inside of the cabin was near freezing. His boots were stiff with ice. Water in the basin was solid. His hands shook so badly he struggled to relight the stove. He survived, but barely, and the lesson stayed with him. Cold teaches quickly. After that winter, he stopped thinking like a builder and started thinking like a system. He paid attention to how heat moved, how fast it vanished, how the cabin warmed quickly but cooled even faster. He noticed that the air felt warm near the fire but cold everywhere else. He noticed how the walls never felt warm to the touch, no matter how long the stove burned. He didn't talk much about it. Frontier communities respected work more than words. Instead, he watched. He asked quiet questions. He remembered what old masons in Europe had done with stone and brick, not to look impressive, but to hold warmth through long nights. He wasn't trying to reinvent frontier life. He wanted one thing: a cabin that didn't punish you the moment the fire went out. When he began building again, he made a decision most men never questioned. He accepted that winter nights were when people were weakest, tired, asleep, unable to tend a fire every hour. That was the moment a cabin had to work on its own. So he planned for failure. He planned for fires to die, for winds to rise, for exhaustion to win. His shelter needed to carry heat forward, not demand constant attention. That idea alone set him apart, because most men built cabins that depended on them staying awake. He wanted a cabin that could take over when he couldn't. When construction started, people noticed immediately that something was wrong. The footprint was normal. The logs looked familiar. But then came the second wall. Most cabins ended once the outer logs were stacked and chinked. This one didn't. 18 inches inside the first wall, he began building another shorter logs, tighter joints. Slower work. Men stopped to watch. Some laughed. Some shook their heads. Double walls meant double labor, double cutting, double hauling. On the frontier, that alone was enough to mark the idea as foolish. Winter didn't reward extra effort, people said. It rewarded speed. Then came the stone, not a fireplace, not a hearth. Stone stacked between the two walls, layer by layer from the foundation upward. River rock, field stone, heavy pieces hauled by hand, fitted tight. No gaps, no loose fill. That's when the comments turned sharp. Stone didn't burn. Stone was cold. Stone pulled heat out of a room. Everyone knew that. They'd felt it leaning against a fireplace on a cold morning. Stone meant dampness, rot, mold. Men had lost cabins to moisture trapped where air couldn't move. The criticism wasn't cruel, it was practical. Experienced builders warned him plainly this would fail, not might, would. And from their point of view, they were right. Frontier life punished cleverness. Most innovations died quietly because the old ways already worked well enough. Trying something new wasn't brave, it was risky. And risk threatened families, not just pride. But the man building that wall wasn't chasing cleverness. He wasn't trying to prove anyone wrong. He was solving a problem he had personally nearly died from. He kept working. Stone by stone, the wall grew thicker than any cabin nearby. The interior darkened. Windows were smaller. The structure looked heavy, almost defensive. More fort than home. To the settlement, it looked like wasted time before winter. To him, it looked like insurance. He wasn't building for approval. He was building for the night when the fire went out and no one was awake to save him. The men criticizing that cabin weren't ignorant. They were experienced. They had survived winters that killed livestock and broke weaker families, but their understanding of heat was based on feeling, not measurement. They judged warmth by how it felt near the stove, by how fast frost formed on windows, by how often they had to wake up at night to feed the fire. Those were practical measures, but incomplete ones. What no one measured was time. How long heat stayed once it was created, how quickly it escaped through walls, how much energy the structure itself could absorb and return. Frontier builders thought in minutes. Winter demanded thinking in hours. Air warms fast and cools fast. Everyone knew that, even if they didn't say it that way. That's why cabins felt warm quickly when a fire roared and turned cold just as fast when it died. The fire wasn't heating the cabin, it was heating the air inside it. Logs didn't help much. Pine and spruce were light, easy to work, but light materials don't store heat. They slow loss slightly, nothing more. Once the fire stopped, the cold rushed back in. Stone behaved differently, but most men only saw half the story. Yes, cold stone pulled warmth from the air. Anyone who touched it knew that. But that wasn't the end of the process. It was the beginning. Stone didn't destroy heat. It absorbed it. And once enough heat entered the stone, it didn't disappear. It stayed. That difference mattered. Frontiersmen had no thermometers on their walls, no charts, no numbers. They relied on habit and memory, and habit told them stone was the enemy. What they missed was scale. A single stone hearth was small. It stole heat quickly and gave little back. But thousands of pounds of stone, warmed slowly and evenly, behaved like something else entirely. It became storage. The man building the double wall understood that without formulas. He didn't know the terms thermal mass or specific heat. He knew one thing: cold nights were long and fires didn't last. So instead of trying to make the fire stronger, he designed the cabin to remember it. That was the difference. Others fought winter by burning more wood. He planned to make winter wait. On the frontier, people spoke about cold as if it were a thing that attacked you, something you fought back with fire. Burn more wood, get more heat. Simple logic, and in the short term it worked. But short-term thinking is dangerous in winter. Stone behaves differently than air or wood, and that difference changes everything. Air is impatient. Heat it and it warms instantly. Stop feeding it and it leaves just as fast. Wood is only slightly better. Logs slow the escape, but they don't hold much themselves. Stone is patient. When you heat stone, nothing dramatic happens at first. The air still feels cold. The walls feel cold. People watching assume the fire is being wasted, but what's really happening is transfer. Heat is moving out of the air and into the mass of the stone, quietly and steadily. This is where most men gave up. They saw the fire working harder with no immediate reward and assumed failure. They didn't wait long enough to let the system change state. Stone doesn't respond in minutes. It responds in hours. Once warmed stone becomes a reserve, not a flame, but a slow release. It gives heat back at the same calm pace it accepted it. That means no spikes, no sudden drops, just stability. The man building the double wall understood this in practical terms. He didn't want bursts of warmth followed by cold panic. He wanted a cabin that stayed predictable through the night, something that didn't care if the fire died at 2 a.m. He treated heat like savings, not income. Firewood was labor, time, risk. Every trip outside in winter was exposure. Every extra cord cut was energy taken from something else. A system that demanded constant feeding was a system that drained men over time. Stone reduced that demand. Once charged, it worked without attention, while men slept, while storms howled, while exhaustion won. Stone wasn't cold, it was waiting. And once winter truly arrived, that patience became the difference between enduring the night and fearing it. The wall wasn't thick by accident. Every dimension served a purpose. The outer wall did what cabins had always done, blocked wind, shed snow, slowed heat loss. The inner wall created a sealed living space. Between them sat the stone packed tight from the foundation up to chest height where people slept, worked, and lived. This wasn't decoration, it was a machine. Spacing mattered. Too narrow and air wouldn't move. Too wide and the outer wall would leak heat before the stone could store it. The gap was just wide enough to let warm air brush the stone's surface, transferring heat without creating drafts. No open cavities, no loose fill. Everything fit tight. Stone selection mattered too. Dense rock went low where it could store the most energy and stabilize floor temperatures. Slightly lighter stone went higher where it would release warmth sooner. The wall wasn't uniform, it was layered with intent. Moisture was the biggest risk, and he planned for it. The walls were sealed airtight. No uncontrolled airflow. Any moisture that entered stayed warm enough to evaporate back into the living space, instead of condensing into rot. Cold air never touched the stone. The foundation carried the weight. Field stone stacked deep, resting on solid ground. No settling, no shifting. A wall this heavy couldn't move, not without tearing the cabin apart. What he built wasn't faster. It wasn't easier. It wasn't cheaper. It demanded more labor up front, more patience, and more faith in an idea no one else trusted. But it did something ordinary cabins never could. It slowed time. Instead of heat racing out as soon as the fire faded, the wall stretched that warmth across the night. Instead of cold rushing in at dawn, the cabin held steady. Temperature stopped swinging and started leveling. Most cabins thought in minutes, how fast can we heat the air right now? This wall thought in hours. And winter, whether men understood it or not, always rewarded systems that planned that far ahead. When the cabin was finished, the real work began. For 3 straight days, smoke poured from the chimney without pause. Morning, night, no break. He fed the stove steadily, not aggressively. No roaring blaze, no wasteful flare, just constant heat, hour after hour. The neighbors noticed. They counted the wood. They shook their heads. 3 days of burning without comfort to show for it. Looked like failure. The walls still felt cool. The air didn't seem any warmer than usual. To most men, this confirmed their fears. They didn't see heat moving into the stone. They saw wood disappearing. On the frontier, wood meant survival. Burning it without immediate return was seen as recklessness. People assumed he was draining his winter supply before winter even arrived. But he understood what was happening. Those 3 days weren't about heating air, they were about charging the wall. Every hour added another layer of stored energy. The stone was climbing slowly toward equilibrium, absorbing heat deeper and deeper into its mass. This process couldn't be rushed. A hotter fire wouldn't help. It would only waste fuel and stress the system. Slow and steady was the only way. By the end of the 3rd day, something changed. The walls no longer felt cold. They felt neutral, not warm, not cool, balanced. That was the signal he was waiting for. Still, no one believed it mattered. Burning through winter before it starts, people said. He'll be begging for wood by Christmas. He said nothing. He stacked what remained of his supply. He closed the door. And he waited, because systems like this aren't proven in comfort. They're proven when the fire goes out, and winter takes over. The cold arrived without drama, no warning, no gradual adjustment. One morning the valley woke up and winter had taken control. Temperatures dropped hard and stayed there. The kind of cold that doesn't just chill the air, it changes behavior. Doors stay shut. Movement slows. Every task costs more energy than it should. Water freezes fast. Breath hangs inside cabins long after people stop talking. This was the cold that tested systems. In most cabins, the pattern returned immediately. Fires burned hot all evening. Families stayed close to the stove. By midnight, exhaustion set in. Someone fed the fire once more, then slept. By dawn, the cabin was barely above freezing. That's when problems started. Floors turned bitter cold. Toes went numb before sunrise. Children woke crying. Ice formed on the inside of walls where warm breath met cold wood. Getting dressed became painful. Relighting the stove with stiff hands took time, and time mattered. People accepted this as winter life. But that acceptance came at a cost. Constant fatigue, broken sleep, risky trips outside to haul more wood. Every extra hour awake weakened the body. Every cold morning stacked strain on top of strain. Romantic ideas about frontier toughness didn't survive nights like these. Cold wasn't poetic, it wasn't beautiful, it was relentless. It punished mistakes quietly and consistently, and it didn't care how hard someone worked the day before. In this kind of weather, firewood became currency. Families burned through stacks faster than planned. Axes came out before daylight. Men pushed themselves when rest would have been smarter. Accidents happened. The cold turned cabins into liabilities. This was the environment where the double-wall cabin faced its real test. Not against opinions, not against tradition, against exhaustion, hunger, and nights when no one had the strength to keep feeding the fire. This was the moment when winter stopped being something you endured and became something that decided who could rest and who couldn't. The fire would go out. What happened next was the only thing that mattered. That night, the difference became clear. In the standard cabins, fires were fed late and burned hard. Families went to sleep warm, knowing it wouldn't last. By early morning, the heat was gone. The air turned sharp. The floor stole warmth through boots and blankets. Sleep broke into short, shallow stretches. Cold woke people before dawn. In the double-wall cabin, the fire was allowed to die. That alone would have sounded reckless to anyone else in the valley, but the air stayed steady. No sudden drop, no shock. The walls released heat slowly the way they had absorbed it. Hours passed without change. While other cabins fell from comfortable to miserable in a single night, this one barely shifted. Morning came without panic. The interior was still warm enough to move freely, dress without rushing relight, the stove without numb hands. The difference wasn't just temperature, it was control. In the old cabins, people reacted to cold. They chased it. They burned fuel to catch up. In the stone-walled cabin, cold was delayed, managed, held back long enough to matter. Woodpiles told the story clearly. Where others burned constantly, this cabin burned deliberately. Less wood, fewer trips outside, fewer risks. The system didn't make the cabin hot, it made it stable. That mattered more. Stable heat meant deeper sleep, better judgment, stronger bodies over time. It meant mornings started with choices instead of emergencies. Two cabins faced the same winter, same wind, same snow, same temperatures. One demanded constant attention to survive the night. The other worked quietly in the background. By the second week of cold, neighbors noticed the difference without being told. One cabin showed smoke at all hours. The other didn't. One looked tired. The other looked calm. And in winter, calm is a form of strength. The laughter stopped before anyone admitted it. At first, people noticed small things. Smoke rising late at night from most chimneys, but not from his. Men splitting wood at dawn with stiff shoulders while his door stayed closed. Children walking stiffly across frozen floors elsewhere, while his moved normally inside. No one said anything right away. Frontier communities were proud places. Admitting doubt felt like weakness. But winter has a way of forcing honesty. It strips away opinions and leaves only results. One morning, a neighbor came by on the excuse of borrowed tools. He didn't ask questions. He stepped inside, felt the air, and paused. The walls were warm to the touch, not hot, not cold, alive with stored heat. That moment mattered more than any argument. Soon others came. Quiet visits, no jokes, no warnings, just men standing still, absorbing what their senses told them. They noticed that the fire wasn't burning. They noticed the temperature didn't drop. They noticed the absence of urgency. One builder brought a thermometer. Numbers don't lie the way pride does. He checked the air, the wall, the exterior surface. The difference was undeniable. Heat inside, cold outside, stability in between. No one spoke for a long moment. Then someone said the words that mattered most on the frontier. "This works." Those words carried weight because they came from experience, not theory. From men who had built cabins their entire lives. Men who didn't change methods lightly. What replaced laughter wasn't admiration. It was focus. They wanted details, measurements, stone types, spacing, foundation depth, how long to burn the first fire, how airtight was airtight, how much weight the ground could handle. The man who built the wall answered every question without pride. He didn't claim genius. He didn't mock the old ways. He explained what he had seen and what winter had confirmed. By the end of that week, no one called the wall foolish anymore. They called it expensive and worth it, because winter hadn't just proven an idea. It had changed how the valley thought about survival. The real advantage of the wall wasn't comfort, it was margin. In winter, survival isn't decided by average conditions. It's decided by bad nights, by the hours when someone is sick, exhausted, injured, or simply asleep. That's when systems fail and consequences arrive. The double-wall cabin created margin where none existed before. Because the heat didn't vanish when the fire went out, people could rest. Sleep stopped being a risk. Nights no longer demanded vigilance. That alone changed everything. Wood consumption dropped sharply, not because fires burned weaker, but because they burned smarter. Instead of reheating cold air again and again, the fire maintained the stone's temperature. Less wood moved more heat over more time. That mattered. Every cord of wood saved meant fewer trips into snow and wind, fewer hours swinging an axe with numb hands, fewer injuries, fewer mistakes made while tired and cold. On the frontier, efficiency wasn't about comfort, it was about reducing exposure. The wall also protected the vulnerable. Children and older adults suffer first in cold environments. Their bodies lose heat faster, they wake slower, they recover slower. A stable interior temperature reduced frost injuries, illness, and long-term strain. Warm floors mattered. So did mornings that didn't start below freezing. The cabin became predictable. Predictability is rare in winter and priceless when it appears. When you know the temperature won't crash overnight, you plan differently. You conserve energy. You make better decisions. You don't panic when storms stretch longer than expected. This wasn't about luxury, it was about resilience. Frontier families accepted cold because they believed it was unavoidable. The wall proved that belief wrong. Cold could be slowed, managed, stored against. And once people saw that they couldn't unsee it, the wall didn't just save fuel, it saved attention, it saved strength, it saved people from the quiet failures that happen when exhaustion stacks up night after night. Winter didn't become easy, but it became survivable without constant sacrifice. And on the frontier, that difference was everything. Once winter loosened its grip, people talked about the wall as if it had always made sense. That's how frontier knowledge often works. It's resisted at first, accepted reluctantly, then treated as obvious in hindsight. But what spreads easily can also fade just as fast. The wall took more time to build, more stone to haul, more planning. It wasn't the kind of solution that fit a rush before first snowfall. As settlements grew, priorities shifted. Speed mattered. Lumber got cheaper. Railroads brought materials that promised faster results with less labor. and insulation changed the conversation. New materials slowed heat loss effectively. Walls went up quicker, cabins warmed fast. For everyday living that felt like progress. What those systems didn't do was store heat. They reduced loss, but they offered no reserve when the fire failed. People stopped thinking in terms of thermal behavior and started thinking in terms of convenience. The old wall didn't disappear because it didn't work. It disappeared because it asked more from builders up front. And as winters became less directly lethal, for many fewer people felt the cost of forgetting. Knowledge that only matters in extreme conditions is easy to ignore during mild years. By the early 20th century, few remembered why stone walls had been built the way they were. Fewer still understood the logic behind them. The idea survived quietly in other cultures: masonry stoves, thick earthen homes, heavy foundations, but the frontier version faded into stories. What remained was the assumption that modern meant better. It took another century for engineers to rename old ideas with new language: thermal mass, passive heat storage, energy efficiency. The principles didn't change, only the vocabulary did. And when people rebuilt those walls and tested them again, the results matched the old observations exactly. Slow heating, slow cooling, stability through the night. The lesson wasn't lost because it was wrong. It was lost because it wasn't convenient. Frontier builders learned it the hard way through exhaustion injury and close calls. Modern builders rediscovered it through data and testing. But the wall had never stopped working. People had simply stopped listening to winter long enough to remember why it mattered. The lesson of that wall was never really about stone. It was about how frontier people survived long enough to pass knowledge forward and how easily that knowledge can be dismissed when conditions soften. Winter didn't reward effort alone. It rewarded understanding. Men who burned more wood weren't stronger. They were compensating for systems that leaked energy faster than they could replace it. The wall didn't fight winter, it cooperated with it. Instead of chasing warmth every hour, it accepted heat, slowly held it quietly, and gave it back when people were weakest. That's not cleverness, that's respect for how the world actually works. Frontier wisdom often gets romanticized as toughness, grit, endurance. But real survival was quieter than that. It was planning so well that you didn't have to suffer unnecessarily. It was building systems that kept working when you were tired, sick, or asleep. The man who built that wall didn't invent anything new. Similar ideas existed in older cultures long before he arrived. What he did was adapt them to frontier reality: limited tools, limited time, real consequences. He listened to winter instead of arguing with it. That's the part worth remembering. Modern life hides these lessons behind convenience. Heat comes on at the flip of a switch. Cold feels temporary, but remove that layer and the old rules return fast. Heat still moves the same way. Materials still behave the same way. And exhaustion still makes bad situations worse. The frontier didn't produce wisdom because people were tougher back then. It produced wisdom because mistakes were expensive. That wall stands as a reminder that survival isn't about doing more. It's about doing the right thing once so you don't have to keep paying for it later. Winter will always test what we build. The question is whether we build for the moment or for the night when the fire goes out.